Hello, Savannah. Great to be here. Thank you, Linda, for that gracious introduction. I arrived here yesterday, and I can't believe that I've been here less than 24 hours because I already have so many new girlfriends. I want to give a special thanks to Stephanie Duttenhaver. I met her yesterday and said, "Where can I get a haircut?" And I had just come off the plane and was looking a bit shaggy. And she said, you want to get a haircut in Savannah on a Saturday without an appointment? And I realized that I had asked her a very large favor, but somehow she managed to squeeze me onto the schedule at Aqua, where she regularly goes, so thank you. And Beth Logan, who has been my escort. We both agree that's a terrible word, since I arrived yesterday, and we've had such a good time. She's just amazingly spirited company. I asked her what I should talk about today, and she said, "Well, haven't you planned anything?" And I said, "Well, you know," she said, "what we really like is for authors to talk about themselves, as opposed to your book. Try to give a little bit about your process and tell us how and why you became a writer." And I thought, well, you know, I'm a journalist and a writer of nonfiction and an art critic, and the reason I write about art is precisely so I don't have to think about myself or talk about myself. So I'm going to keep the part about myself very, very brief, at the risk of boring you to tears. I grew up in New York, and then New Rochelle, New York. And I always wanted to be an art critic. It was just, I don't know how to explain it. And I'm sure one day they'll discover a gene for it, and then it will all be clear. But as a child, while other girls were writing fan letters to Paul and Ringo and John, I used to write fan letters to Hilton Kramer, who was the chief art critic of the New York Times. And I'm sure I'm the only person who, in fact, ever did write him fan letters. He was sort of famously crabby. I found him to be just a marvel of frankness and perceptiveness. And he never wrote back. But when I was in high school, he did publish one of my letters in the Times, in the column called Art Mailbag. And I just remember screaming with joy, and my mother saying, what are you so excited about? And I said, "Ma, they published my letter." And she was like, "Well, why is that, you know, why is that exciting?" And, but anyway, I do find it very exciting. I continue to find it exciting to write and publish. And I think that it's really the best way of thinking, I find. A lot of critics agree that they really don't know what they think about a show or a work of art or almost anything until they sit down on deadline and are forced to decide. So writing for me has always been a very clarifying process. And if I'm away from my writing too long, I just feel the need for clarity. It comes to me also when I'm reading. I love reading in bed. And, but I find being away from words generally just confuses the situation. And words for me have always been a great clarifying force. So let's see, I studied art history at Cornell University, and my interests were always divided between art and journalism. I worked as a guide during my college years, not a guide, a guard. Actually, I was a guard, if you can believe it, at the Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art, which was my university museum, and was not a very good guard. I don't think I would have noticed had anybody made off with any art, because mostly I just sat there reading. And I was also an editor of the Cornell Daily Sun. I was editor of the editorial page, and during my senior year of college, Playboy magazine arrived on campus because they were doing a feature called Women of the Ivy League. And they were going from school to school asking women to pose, and that caused a predictable uproar on campus. This is the 70s, it's the height of feminism. And at that point, I wrote an editorial defending the right of women to pose for Playboy, because I thought, free choice. Women should be free to choose whether or not they are going to subject themselves to the degradation of Playboy magazine. And so then Phil Donahue invited me to fly to Chicago and debate a very militant feminist from Brown University, who was a pretty scary woman, but I did that. And that was my first big controversy. And I mean, I know I did not pose for Playboy. Okay, then what came next? Columbia Journalism School, which is an interesting experience because it gets you to New York City. And I think it's good to live in any city that has a lot of cultural institutions. For most of my career, after school I did briefly have full-time jobs. I worked at the Miami Herald, the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, and the Dallas Times-Herald as a newspaper reporter, covering anything that I was asked to cover. And the highlight of my career came when I was sent to cover a tornado in Paris, Texas. It was very exciting. We went in a helicopter right after the storm settled. And, but after just a few years, I really thought I should be writing on my own. I think if you're very disciplined, and if you're the type of writer who can be at your desk at 8 in the morning, you don't really need to have a job. If you can keep yourself at your desk and stay there all day, then chances are you're going to get something done. Because I think that is the key to writing. It's sitting at your desk, as obvious as that sounds. And sometimes, of course, it can be hard to sit there for a variety of reasons. Not just because the world is so full of distractions, but also because to sit at your desk is inevitably to look at your own writing. And that can be a very discouraging experience when you look at your own pages. So I think the trick is to just assume that somehow it'll work out if you sit there long enough. I worked as the art critic for the Wall Street Journal and then ended up at the New York Times doing the Questions For column for many years, which was a lot of fun because I didn't have to write at all. I just got to ask questions and interview people. And I mean, there's nothing more fun than being a writer who doesn't have to write. So, and that was also the years when my 2 sons were growing up, and I was very grateful that I didn't have to write them, because when I'm writing, I go into, what my husband, who's sitting here, calls the zone, and I don't really notice anything around me. He said I suffer from an attention surplus disease. Is that what it's called? Attention surplus disease. So that was great to do while my kids were growing up, because it allowed me to be conscious of what was happening around me. And then the boys went off to college, and at that point, I had already written a few books, and I had started my Norman Rockwell book, and I really threw myself into it. It was a perfect thing to do once the boys were gone. And I became quite obsessed with it. I had started the book years earlier after writing a piece in the New York Times about the rehabilitation of certain reputations, including Rockwell's. And I had received a phone call the next morning from Jarvis Rockwell, who was Norman Rockwell's oldest son. He's now 82, he's an artist himself. And he said, hey, that was a fun piece. Why don't you write a biography of my father? And he was kind of joking, but maybe kind of not. And the more I thought about it, the more I really became deeply interested in the subject. I came from a traditional art history background. Rockwell had always been written off as a hack and a promoter of kitsch and calendars and Boy Scouts and grandmothers and Thanksgiving turkeys. And, but I saw a show of his at the Guggenheim Museum in 2001. And was completely blown away by it and realized, that I thought the time was come to look seriously at this career and to figure out who he was and why he had been treated so harshly by the 20th century. And so I've been working on that book for the past few years since the boys left, and it was just endlessly fascinating to me. I found that the more I learned, the more mysterious he became. And it fascinated me that I could look at his paintings for such a long time, and that they raised so many questions. He died 35 years ago, and illustration, as you all know, is